Welcome back to the end of the day. We're going to do a bit of a panel, but we want this to be a little bit more interactive. So if at any point you do have questions, just put your hand up and hopefully I'll spot you and try to get the questions arranged for the audience, the panelists. First, I'll get the panelists to say who they are, what they do, what's the one thing they wish they had known before starting their journey in microservices? So, Matt, we'll start with you.
Hi. So my name is Matt Heath. I work at Monzo. I work within our kind of platform team as a backend engineer. And I guess I've been working on microservices for about 7 years now. And what's the one thing? The one thing I wish I'd known. I guess like how things can spiral not out of control, but how things can rapidly get more complex as your business develops. I think, yeah, I didn't expect that.
I'm Alex, and I'm a software engineer for Segment. And I've been working with microservices for about 3 years now. And I think the thing that I'd wish I'd known in the beginning was that you can solve some of the trade-offs that come with moving to microservices without actually moving to microservices. I think sometimes people get a little bit blinded and they see that they're having issues where they don't have this good fault isolation, and microservice gives you that, but you can actually address that without making the switch to microservices. So I wished we'd known that it was possible to address a lot of the issues we were seeing without going to microservices.
Hi, I'm Manuel. I'm a consultant and I'm co-author of the book Team Topologies. So from the people here, I'm probably the one who has least direct experience with microservices. As a consultant, especially in continuous delivery, what I've felt is a lot of kind of the pain from the clients that kind of, as you were saying, went for microservices too early, trying to optimize for something that was not really the problem they had. And not thinking about other problems in terms of their engineering practices or dependencies between teams, and so on, just thinking, it's all around the architecture when there were other problems. So kind of, as Simon Newman was saying this morning, identify first what problem you're trying to solve, and then seek out the solution, which might be microservices or not.
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm a principal engineer at the Financial Times. I think the one thing I wish I'd known is how important tooling is when it comes to microservices. I think we already knew to some extent for things like orchestration and stuff, you needed some level of tooling, but actually there's just a whole array of like dev tooling that becomes much more and more, stuff that's useful without microservices becomes essential when you do have microservices.
Luke, as we're talking, this panel is supposed to be microservices, are they still worth it? Can you see real benefit to your organization or your customers from this microservice approach at the FT?
Yeah, I think it definitely, in terms of speeding up delivery, and like Alex was talking about isolating things, I think it's really beneficial for that way, and it's brought us a long way forward. It does have its pitfalls and stuff, but I think on the whole it has been beneficial.
Matt, how about Monzo? How has Monzo benefited from using microservices?
I'd say in quite a similar way. By using microservices, our teams can work quite independently. For context, Monzo is a bank. It's quite easy to say that banks are complicated, but we have lots of different systems, and that means that we can work on those very independently. So yeah, it's helped us deal with the complexity.
Now, Alex, your company has done a bit of a U-turn. I don't know how many people were in the talk earlier, and gone back to a more monolithic approach. What do you think the key benefit for that U-turn was?
I think that the driving force behind that for us was two things. One, the operational overhead that came with microservices was just too great, and we didn't have good tooling around testing and deploying and maintaining these microservices. And then I think one of the other driving factors was we finally understood what the root issue was in our system that we were trying to address with microservices, and it didn't actually address that. So once we finally had this kind of understanding of what the core issue was, we were actually able to address it, and moving back to a monolith was actually what helped us address it more easily.
Coming back to you briefly, Matt, actually, I'm going to ask the audience something. Who's seen the architectural diagram for the microservices at Monzo on Twitter? Yeah, probably over half of you. So we're all quite aware of the pure scale of the microservices. There is a lot going on there. Do you think that's? Do you think that? Are you seeing cracks at this monumental scale, or is it the right approach still?
Yeah, I think it's quite easy when you look at a diagram. With that many moving parts, it's quite hard to represent it on a single diagram. But I don't think that would be any different if our organization had like 50 applications. We have 1,600 and something, and that means that there's a lot of moving parts, but it doesn't mean that everything's quite small. So the main problems we have are making sure people have the right information, but people don't have to understand how everything works. They can just know how their cluster of things work. Tooling's the main thing. We've had to build out a lot of complex, fairly complex tooling. Yeah, those are the kind of things we've had to focus our efforts on.
Oh, well, you look at microservices and organizations from a more team angle. Surely there's a lot of beneficial things from team organization that this kind of technology can provide.
Yes and no. So I think it's all about when is the right time to think about it, microservices to fix the problem you have. So like I was saying, often it's kind of premature trying to optimize something because microservices is all around. A lot of talk about it. We think that's going to fix all our problems. And so organizations often don't realize to actually benefit from microservice, you need to do a lot more changes. It's not just the technical architecture. If you go one step back, you need to think about Conway's Law and how the team structures are mapped with the services that you have. So they should be aligned to a large extent, not one-to-one, but they should be aligned. Otherwise, you're fighting against that. And then also, have you thought about things like decoupling teams, but also decoupling environments? If you have static environments for testing, decoupling the release process. And so all these other aspects you need to consider to actually take full benefit of microservices, not always thought out. Once you have that kind of done, then I think microservices are really good at making sure we're aligning the teams and the services with the business areas, or the streams of value in our business. That can be very powerful. And then if you want to promote a faster change, faster cadence of change, then microservices can help you on that with separation at multiple levels, the data store level and at the realizability, the deployability level. But it's kind of a journey that you need to go through until it's actually going to bring the benefits that you expect. And so it's often done too early, and we should be thinking then at other areas that we might be overlooking. For example, Conway's Law that I mentioned, also cognitive load is kind of something we talk about in team topologies, which is almost every team or in almost every organization, some teams feel like they're overloaded. If you ask them to own the services and be able to build, test, operate, support, and understand enough to do that, they probably have too much on their plate. And so we need to think about the right size of software for teams. Whether that's microservices or not is kind of the next question, I would say.
And how, coming back to the sort of Conway's Law, how do you sort of recommend changes in that organization? So business functionality evolves, and so does the team structure. How do you marry that with the technology and the ownership below?
That's a very good question. So what we see happening, which is probably not what we want, is sometimes decisions are being made, especially around the team structures and the organization, by HR people or senior management. So to some extent, because of the mirroring effect of Conway's Law, they are deciding on our software architecture to some extent. And so we don't want that. So what we're saying is we actually need to bring those two kind of worlds together. We need to make technology and design decisions together with team structure decisions. Otherwise, one is kind of restricting what the other is able to do.
Matt, you must have come across a very similar thing because Monzo's growth has been stratospheric for quite a while. So you must have had to change your organisation, but you don't want to chuck out all the tech at the same time.
Yeah, our company's probably changed pretty much to a new company every 6 to 12 months for the last 5 years. And that means that we have some areas that are a bit more stable, but other areas that are like quite rapidly in flux. And I think that's one of the reasons that such like a granular set of services works for us. All of our services are very, very similar. We kind of have like a box that you put the code in, and you get lots of nice properties. Netflix call that the paved road. And that means that because the similarities, the differences aren't that big, so it's quite easy for people to pick up a new application. So when we reform teams or when we refocus areas, we can divide the boundaries like a lot more granularly. Otherwise, we would have essentially a whole ton of payment systems, and we wouldn't be able to move people, and people wouldn't be able to move off if they wanted to like go and work on a different area because they have specific expertise there. But yeah, we can change that quite a lot.
How do you keep the sort of continuity of knowledge when people are moving around?
Very good question. Yeah, I think that's something where honestly, you have like two problems. I think documentation, but the real question is what you're documenting. In the case of Monzo, we have debit cards. We used to use an outsourced card provider. We brought that in-house, so we've built a MasterCard processor. There's quite a lot of domain knowledge there, and that's one of like 10, 20 different equivalence scale projects. So you have both a load of people who've gone and read 10 or 15,000 pages of MasterCard documentation to understand how those systems work and have deep domain knowledge. That's not something you can easily transfer. So I think we have kind of a mixture of people who want to spend an area and become like domain experts there. That works really well for them. And then in other areas, by having the services, like each service being quite consistent in how it works, it means people can pick up how our system that models that quite quickly, and then build on the domain knowledge there.
Thank you, Matt. Alex, as you've moved more back towards a monolithic approach, what now is your biggest operational challenge?
I think the biggest operational challenge that we deal with now is at any point in time in our monolithic worker, we're running about 2,000 to 4,000 tasks or workers. And this means in-memory caching is not very efficient across these thousands of workers. And so something that we've introduced to help us with this is Redis. And Redis has now become a point that we have to consider every time we need to scale. And we've had issues in the past where the Redis becomes unavailable and then the workers are crashing. And so that has now added an additional point of scaling for us. And it's something that's been consistently coming up that we have to deal with. But we've done different things like moving to a Redis cluster, sharding it, but it's still something in the back of our minds that we wish wasn't there, but it's not enough for us to move back to microservices just to get the benefit of caching. It's a trade-off that we were willing and are comfortable to take.
So, Luke, on the opposite end of the scale at the FT, what would you see as a widely adopted microservices architecture, your biggest operational challenge?
I think it's where there's team boundaries. I find is often the hardest. It's trying to, if there's an incident or stuff, it's tracking it across multiple teams. It's understanding where the fault lies. Teams are very good at understanding their own little pocket of things, but like I was saying in my talk, we have a publishing pipeline. It goes from there's a tech team that works with the editorial staff, then there's a publishing platform team, and then there's a team that are working on the front-end website for the users. And each of these teams, very mature in their thinking, but whenever it goes from one to the next bit, things get missed. People can't, it's hard to trace exact problems and that sort of stuff.
Manuel, do you have any sort of advice for this?
Yes. So on one hand, I think there's a key term there, kind of team boundaries, right? So again, with Conway's law, we want the service boundaries, team boundaries to be aligned, but then how do they interact when there are problems, when we need to diagnose what's going on? So a couple of things. One is if we have good platform teams, so I get I get the feeling that at Monzo you have a pretty good kind of platform team to allow that kind of scale and that kind of repeatability in a way between different services. So having a good platform team that provides you the tools and the mechanisms to do that kind of fast diagnosing, kind of more on the tool side. But then you could do things like swarming, so different teams work on different services or people from those different teams to be on a kind of rotation, if you like, where this person is going to be part of this swarm to identify, to diagnose this problem, where is it exactly coming from, or possibly there are multiple reasons, and then address that more quickly than this kind of hierarchical support from someone identified a problem the customer has, and then now we have to try to sort out who is responsible. So having that kind of swarm can be helpful.
Matt, does Monzo address it in a similar way? Because it must be very hard to diagnose where one capability is actually being affected by a single service.
Sometimes, but a lot of the time it's fairly straightforward. I think the way that we think about that, we have lots of different services and we have very, very strong consistency between the ways they work. So that means we have standardized dashboards for every single service. We can use tools like tracing to kind of track that back. So what we'll usually see is some particular business metrics, say cards are declining or payments of a particular type aren't working or a particular API doesn't work. And in that case, it's relatively straightforward to pin that through into the particular root cause. Each of those are then owned by different teams. We have, up until relatively recently, we had one group for on-call who had a rotation. We are now pushing, we have specialist on-call, so that's being pushed out into teams. And at some point, we'll probably switch that around. So the initial on-call team will be the owning team, which can then escalate it to a kind of global team. So I think, yeah, the boundaries between those teams are definitely the hardest things. But it's because everything is so similar in the same language, like literally the same kind of service structure. Many of the people who are on call can kind of look at a particular thing and work out why while we're waiting for other people to get online and kind of go through that problem.
Alex, you must implicitly get the benefits of that, going back towards a monolith, because you're not going to have a monolith made up of 5 languages.
Yes, exactly. Our monolith is in one language, and that was one of the benefits that just came naturally of moving to moving to a monolith. Luckily, when we did move into microservices for a bit, we still kept everything in one language. We were good about defining certain standards of how these microservices were going to work because we knew the complexity that was coming with it. So yeah, it was a benefit of moving back to a monolith, was getting that kind of stuff for free and forcing us all to use some of the same things.
I'm just wondering if there's any questions from the audience at this time. Microphone's coming your way.
There was someone here?
Yeah, right in the middle.
Quick question. Sorry. Yeah. As Monzo has more than 1,500 microservices, right? So how to basically define the bounded context when you build so many microservices?
Yeah. I think if you look at it as, if we had like a relatively simple product, it would be very difficult to take, I don't know, like an image website, for example, and slice and dice that into 1,500 pieces. That would be pure insanity. Don't do that. But if you then add like 10 or 15 different payment networks and you start operating in multiple countries and you have various product features that are quite different, we integrate with, I'm honestly not sure how many different partners for a variety of different things. So we launched a credit scoring product a week or so ago, which means that's a whole set of services that interact with a couple of particular third parties. That allows the user to like give consent, we can track that. But those things are very isolated from like how your card works. So the bounded context in those things is pretty much like take a problem, and for credit scoring, we clearly have something that needs to interact with a third party. There's probably some bounded thing there, their API. We also have our API to the app. And by the time you divide that up, you've probably got like 5 or 6 different services. So they will have a very tightly defined responsibility. They will have their own API. We use HTTP internally. One of the things that we're kind of thinking about is that's a lot of APIs for someone to think about. So some of those aren't really used outside of teams. Maybe they're like more of a kind of private API versus a public API. That's something we're kind of thinking a bit about. But we essentially have lots of different teams who are providing a service, almost like an S3 API or some other API, to a number of other teams. And by the time you add those things up, there's a lot of services. Yeah. Does that make sense? Cool.
Is there any more questions? We've got two, so. How about one over there? There's Stoughton.
Speaking of microservices and team boundaries, how do you suggest adopting like ownership of services and changing of teams? Like we have a growing organization, team responsibilities change, and then suddenly we have a bunch of microservices from like the organizational structure 6 months ago, and they become tech debt. So how would you cope with older stuff then?
Any particular person? I think it's probably...
No, just for the panel, maybe some insights
Manuel,
there.
would you like to take
Sure. So I think one of the keys is to have stable teams. So, and the other key is that all the services need to be owned by a team. So once you have those two things, the organization can evolve, and you can have people changing teams, but you don't recreate teams or create a team just for this new microservice, and then sometime later the team that's doing another microservice. So, and once you have stable teams and have ownership, it's much clearer the alignment between team structures and services. And also, you can try to promote that all the teams or most of the teams might be working on some new service, but also retain ownership on a kind of older one that doesn't change much. Because then what you can do, perhaps with microservices not so clear yet because it's more new, but for older type of architecture, then if you have an older service and you're also responsible for the new service, then you bring in the good tooling, the good whatever telemetry, centralized logging, whatever it might be, into the old service, even if it's not changing that often. But you keep kind of parity on, and you evolve both at the same time. So to me, that's useful.
Luke, do you have anything to add? Because this is definitely an area that you've suffered with, sort of good and bad.
Yeah, like in the FT, it's quite hard because we use different teams use completely different programming languages, different tech stacks, different. If there's something that could be different, someone will be doing it different. So it can be really hard to move things from one team to another. Although one benefit I do think of microservices is it becomes easier to sort of rewrite small bits of your stack. If it is moving from one team to another that is radically different, and they're like, that's in a programming language we're not comfortable with, we don't have the skills, it's a lot smaller undertaking to go, okay, well, that's one or two microservices that need to change with this org structure. It's a smaller undertaking for them to go, you know what, we're going to rewrite 2 microservices than we need to replace this entire monolith. So it's always about making that judgment call of, is this worth a rewrite? You know, if a team feels much more ownership over things. I've seen many cases where I've seen a perfectly good system sitting there and a team just doesn't feel comfortable with it. And there's not really a good technical reason to rewrite it, but for the sake of team ownership and that sort of stuff, it actually pays dividends in the long term to just be like, you know what, we're going to replace it, we'll build a new one, and then everyone feels comfortable with it.
I think there was another question. It's this gentleman in the grey, yeah.
Hi, the question I have is the following. I've seen some scenarios where within teams there multiple services are created, and these teams did not consider, for example, to structure the code within the same code base, for example, to make it more modular. So I'd like to hear from the panel their opinion about that. When should you decide to take the step to microservices instead of just structure your code to make it more modular within the same unit of deployment.
Matt, what's your opinion on this one?
I think it depends. I'm not going to be as extreme as you might think I would be. I think there needs to be a good reason to pull things out of an application into another application. Whether that is because you've added functionality and now it's too complicated, or it's kind of sharing responsibilities that now potentially 2 teams are involved. We talked about features a second ago. Is that feature being maintained and is it in this code base? So should we, what's the life cycle of that thing? There are certain points where it's useful to pull those out. If you already have an architecture that supports that and you already have lots of tooling in place, then in our case we do. So we have a service and maybe we've added something that's made it a bit more complex, and then maybe a point that we refactor that to pull that out. Normally we'll make it backwards compatible, so we'll move the service out, proxy it through to this one, which Sam kind of gave an example of this morning, and then at some point update the clients to use this. But I think it only makes sense if you have that tooling already. Otherwise, you'd be much better tidying up the modules, getting consistency within your code base so that it's simpler and easier to understand within that application.
Alex, you're the natural opposite to this one.
Yeah, I think that we did actually break apart our repos at one point, and it didn't turn out to be as much of an advantage as we thought it was going to be. Our primary motivation for breaking it out was failing tests were impacting different things. You'd go in to change one thing, and then tests were breaking somewhere else, and now you have to spend time fixing those tests. But breaking them out into separate repos only made that worse, because now I go in and touch something that hasn't been touched in 6 months, and those tests are completely broken because we aren't forced to spend time fixing that. So I think one of the only cases that I've really seen to break stuff out into separate repos and not services is maybe if you have a chunk of code that is shared between multiple services and you want to make it a shared library. But other than that, I think we've found even when we move to microservices, we still prefer stuff in a monorepo.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Oh, I don't know who was first, I'm sorry.
My question is for Alex. So basically you said earlier that you were facing some issues, so you took a microservices approach, and then later on you realized that, okay, this is not working, and you again come back to monolithic one. So my question is what problem you thought that could be solved by microservices, and then later on you realized that, okay, this is not a good thing, and we should move to the monolithic one.
Can you repeat the second half of that question? Sorry.
My question is, what were the problems for which you think that microservices is a better approach, and then after developing it using a microservices approach, you then again change back the monolithic one. So what were those problems and how you solved them using the monolithic approach?
Yeah, so the original problems that we were facing was with our monolithic setup, and we were using a queue that the monolithic worker consumed from, and something that we were facing was if there were issues consuming from this queue, it would back up, and that would impact everything in our monolithic worker. And we wanted to be able to separate them from one another. So we didn't want one piece of the worker able to cause issues with the rest of the stuff that was in the worker. And it was really the queue that we were using. You could only kind of consume what was first in line. And so what microservices provide, though, one of the benefits of them is environmental isolation. So we thought, okay, great, if we break out into separate queues and separate workers, that isolates them nicely from one another, so now they're not impacting each other. But what we learned with that over time actually was that it did isolate them from one another, but now everybody, if this worker was having an issue, all customers using that were still were impacted, even if it was only one customer was the cause. So it isolated the issue and like decreased the blast radius, but it didn't solve the root problem of our queuing system, was really what was crippling us, because it was kind of this first in, first out way of consuming. So how we solved it was we actually got rid of all of that queuing system, and we built something internally to isolate them better from one another. So that's how, but I could see how in the time when we decided to move to microservices, we were like, oh, you'll get great environmental isolation out of the box, it solves our problem. But since we didn't have a good understanding that it wasn't actually everything in a monolith that was the issue, and it was the queue, we made that decision potentially. Potentially wasn't the best decision, but you never know. And so I think then once we finally had that understanding and this like moment of realizing what the problem actually was, and then we were able to fix it, and a monolith would actually worked better in that situation. So yeah, that was the main reason for us.
Okay, to finish up, if we start over at Luke's side, if you had one bit of advice for the audience, either on adoption or maturing their microservices architecture, what would it be?
I think a lot of it's about keeping track of what you've got, right? So it can easily run away from you. You start with a couple and you're like, oh, these are easy, but keeping, having tooling, data, monitoring, all these things, keeping track of everything, do it from the get-go. Don't wait till you've got 100 microservices and then go, what was the first one we built? You know, start at the start. Make sure you're documenting these things as you go along, because once you've got a lot of them, it's really easy to lose one in the mix.
I need to go with three-part answer.
Oh, okay.
I'll try to be brief. So first, start assessing your team's cognitive load. This is a common problem. So hopefully we have kind of end-to-end ownership in the teams, but whatever their responsibilities is, make sure the size of the software and other responsibilities they have matches their cognitive capacity. So there is a specific definition of what cognitive load is, but you can look it up. But essentially, ask the teams, because there's a kind of psychological aspect here too. If people don't understand they're part of the system well enough, whether it's microservices or something else, if they feel anxious, if I have to be on call and I really hope nothing happens in this part of the software, otherwise I'm going to be in trouble, then you need to address that. The second thing is remember Conway's Law. I would suggest print it out, put it out on your office, just so everyone remembers that we can't think in isolation we can't design software in isolation from thinking about team structures. And the third thing is microservices are really beneficial if they're aligned with the business stream of value, right? If this happens all the time. You just go on Twitter and you'll see people complaining, well, I have microservices, but for any type of feature or business change, I need to have coordination between 3, 4, 5 different microservices teams. So that's not what you wanted to achieve in the first place, right? This independent deployability, as Sam was saying, and it's also independent business streams is the goal. It's not just the technical side by itself.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, I think I would, when you're considering to move to microservices, that make sure they're actually addressing the problems that you're having. For example, like us, like I mentioned, we thought we were going to get this great environmental isolation, but didn't actually fix that problem. So I would say make sure you're addressing the root problems with microservices, and then from there, make sure you fully understand the trade-offs that are going to come with it. I think what we got really bit by was the operational overhead when we moved to microservices. We only had 10 engineers at the time, and you really almost need a dedicated DevOps team to help build tooling to maintain this infrastructure, and we didn't have that. And that's what ended up biting us in the end, and why we moved back, because we just didn't have resources to build out all this tooling and automation that come with microservices. So I would say just make sure you're extremely familiar with the trade-offs and you have a good story around each of them, and that you're comfortable with those trade-offs when you make the switch.
Thank you, Alex. Matt?
Might sound weird, but keeping things simple. The simpler and more consistent that your services are, the more consistent your monitoring tools, all of your tools, your development processes, the easier it is for people to pick stuff up and move around. And the amount of code in one of those units is smaller, so it's easier to understand. I think for us that's changed like my mental model from what's happening in the box to how the boxes tie together. And like keeping those things simple pushes a lot of the complexity out into essentially the platform. So yeah, you need like lots of tooling and potentially investments in teams to kind of work on that tooling. Although, I don't know, if we'd started in 5 years, like most of that it exists a lot better than it did 5 years ago, and will continue to.
Okay, I think that's time now. If everybody could put their hands together for an amazing panel.